The radio just went dead right in the middle of the kid's scream. It wasn't static or interference. It was just quiet. Like somebody reached right through the receiver and choked off the sound. We were standing in waist-deep snow on the north side of Mount LeConte. The wind had been dragging ice through the trees all evening, making them pop like old bones. Then, even the forest held its breath. Then we heard him again, but not from the radio. It came from somewhere above us on the trail. A kid's voice, thin and totally exhausted, calling my actual name. Not Ranger. My name. The boy we were looking for had never even met me. I should have put that in the report, but I didn't. I wrote down auditory confusion, because the truth just didn't belong in an official file. But I still hear that voice. Every single winter. And I swear, every time the ice freezes over, it sounds just a little bit closer to me. Look, if you found these recordings, you need to stay with this one. I'm not telling this for attention. I'm telling it because I'm terrified. I might be the last guy alive who remembers the warning. This all went down in the Great Smoky Mountains back in January of 2004. That was way before every hiker carried a GPS tracker or a phone that could save your life. I was working out of the Sugarland side back then. In winter, the park turns into a totally different animal. The crowds thin out, the roads ice over, and the ridges go completely gray and silent. Mount LeConte was always one of those places that could really humble you. It looks beautiful in the postcards, but it turns deadly fast when the weather shifts. Trail names don't mean a thing when you've lost control. The missing kid's name was Aaron Pike. He was 11. His dad brought him and his older sister up for a quick winter hike just to see the snow. They weren't careless people. And that's what makes it worse. His dad said they were near a bend in the trail when the sister slipped and twisted her ankle.
He stopped to help her up.
Aaron was just a few steps ahead, easy to spot in that bright red knit cap. His dad called out for him to wait a second. Aaron stopped, turned around, and lifted one hand. Just a totally normal moment on a family hike. Then this gust of fog just rolled through the trees. It didn't blow across the trail. It dropped straight down on it like a heavy curtain, swallowed everything up in seconds. When it finally cleared, Aaron was just gone. No sound of a fall, no broken branches, no footprints leading off. Just his dad shouting into the woods until his voice gave out. We got the call late that afternoon. The temperature was dropping fast, and ice was already building up on the trees. Search and rescue mobilized from all over, bringing in volunteers and dog teams. We also brought in a couple of locals who knew those ridges better than any map. One of them was Earl Haney, an older guy, lean as fence wire, with a bad knee and a tobacco-stained beard. When I told Earl where the boy vanished, he just stared up at the ridge. He muttered that it was the wrong side of the mountain to be hearing things. Told me, whatever I do, don't chase voices after sundown. People say some pretty odd things in mountain towns. I'd heard all the old stories about lights moving against the wind or kids laughing in empty valleys. I always listened, but back then, I didn't believe a word of it. That first night, we worked in tight grids below the trail, moving slow through deep snow and thickets that could tear your jacket right open. It was pitch black out there, just our headlamps cutting through the ice. The search dogs were really struggling in the cold. One minute they'd catch a scent and pull hard. The next they'd stop dead, tuck their tails, and just whine at the dark trees uphill. Around 8 o'clock that first night, things took a weird turn. One of the volunteers was pushing through this thick patch of rhododendron. His headlamp caught a flash of color. It was Aaron's red knit cap. It wasn't dropped or snagged on a branch like he fell. It was hanging about 6 feet off the ground. Somebody had folded it neatly over the pine needles. It was already crusted over with ice, and there was no sign of a struggle anywhere. When Aaron's dad saw that cap, he just about collapsed, right there in the snow.
We immediately expanded the search grid around those coordinates.
We bagged it up and called it evidence. Though, honestly, none of us knew what the hell it was evidence of. At 9:30 that night, we got our first radio anomaly.
A dispatcher back at base asked our team leader to repeat his last transmission.
He keyed his mic and told her he hadn't said a word. That's when things started getting really strange. The dispatcher came back over the radio, sounding pretty spooked.
She said she'd just picked up a broken message from his unit.
It was a kid crying. And then a voice whispered, "It's warm under here." Nobody on our end heard a thing. 10 minutes later, one of the county guys just froze. He swore he heard small bells ringing from down the slope. Not cowbells, but light, delicate little chimes. Like something you'd tie to a kid's toy.
We sent 2 guys down the slope to check it out.
They pushed through 50 yards of thick mountain laurel. We just stood there in the freezing dark, waiting for them to holler back. But the shout never came. When they finally came back, they looked pale and pissed off. The kind of angry guys get when they're embarrassed by how scared they are. They said they walked straight down the slope. But somehow, they popped out right behind our own flagging tape, facing uphill. Terrain folds in the fog, sure, but that didn't sit right. Near midnight, the weather got so bad, command pulled us back. We were risking more lives than we were saving in that ice. Aaron's dad flat out refused to leave. He stayed out there until he lost feeling in his fingers, and we had to guide him down. While everyone else packed up, Earl lingered at the trailhead. I found him standing alone by this massive hemlock, just staring up into the dark. He didn't even look at me when I walked up. He just asked if I'd ever heard the old Spearfinger stories. I told Earl I knew a little about the Spearfinger stories. Say a natural American voice, recalling a myth. Old Cherokee tales of a stone-skinned witch. Earl spat into the snow and shook his head. He said people just grab old names to pin on whatever scares them. He kept staring up slope into the dark and whispered, "It copies what brings you closer." The second day broke with bright, blinding sun. Somehow that made the whole situation feel even worse. The sky was a hard, clear blue, and the snow glittered on every branch. But down below the spruce canopy, where we were searching, the shadows stayed packed tight and blue-black. At 10:18 that morning, we found Aaron's footprints. It should have been impossible. They were almost half a mile from where he vanished, on a narrow side trace not on any map. Small boot prints moving in a straight line through untouched snow. They came out of a thicket so dense, a child couldn't have passed through without breaking branches. The footprints continued perfectly for 27 steps. And then, right in the middle of an open patch of snow, they just stopped. They didn't end at a rock or a tree or a drop-off. The snow all around the last print was completely smooth and undisturbed. I remember kneeling there at the end of the tracks. I pressed my heavy gloves into the icy crust. My brain was desperately trying to turn it into something normal. I tried to tell myself the wind had filled the resking, or maybe he had stepped backward in his own tracks, even though I knew it was a lie. Earl stood at the very edge of the clearing and absolutely refused to step inside. He looked at our team leader with tired, ancient eyes. He warned us not to call the boy's name here. When the team leader told him to knock it off, Earl just stared back. He asked, "You think it needs his name?" By the afternoon, the surge area had grown way beyond reason.
We had helicopters flying over, but the thick canopy made them useless. Search dogs became erratic again.
One handler finally pulled her dog out after it tucked its tail.
It flat out refused to move past a line of 3 dead fir trees.
Right past those dead trees was where we found the first carving.
It was etched into the bark of an old yellow birch.
It was so old that the tree had actually swollen around the marks. It wasn't letters or any symbol I recognized. Just a row of short vertical cuts, with one longer mark beneath them. Earl walked up, saw the carving on the birch, and went completely quiet. I asked him if he knew what it meant, hoping for some kind of local trail knowledge. He just stared at the marks for a long time. His face was grim. Then he told me to count them. So I stepped closer to the tree and counted the cuts in the bark. There were exactly 11 short marks, and one long mark underneath. A chilling realization. Aaron Pike was 11 years old. We found 2 more trees with those same strange carvings before dark. One had 7 cuts. The other had 9. Earl told me kids had gone missing on this side of the mountain long before the park even existed. He said it happened back before official records. Back before anyone wrote down things that made mountain folks look superstitious. I told Earl that his old stories weren't going to help us find Aaron. He just looked at me with those ancient, tired eyes.
No, he said, but it helps you understand why you won't.
I hated him for saying that. Honestly, maybe I still do. That evening, we pushed one more search line along a narrow ridge. The weather shifted hard and the temperature plummeted. I was with Earl, a young ranger named Lewis, and an SAR volunteer named Caroline Shaw. She was a mom of 2, searching with a quiet fury since dawn. Just before sunset, the impossible happened. We heard Aaron's voice. It wasn't coming over the radio this time. It was drifting up directly from the dark drainage below us. It was faint but clear. A small voice calling out, "Dad." All 4 of us froze in our tracks. Caroline immediately took a step toward the steep slope, her maternal instincts taking over. Before she could take another, Earl lunged. He grabbed her pack so hard he nearly pulled her over backward into the snow. He leaned in close, his face pale.
Don't answer, he whispered.
She spun on him, furious, insisting that it was the boy down there. But Earl just shook his head. Then the voice drifted up again, sounding even weaker. "Please, it's warm under here." Beside me, young Luis slowly crossed himself. I had never seen him do that before. Ignoring Earl's warning, Caroline leaned toward the drop-off and shouted, "Aaron, keep talking!" The moment the words left her mouth, the woods changed. That's the only way I can describe it. The air pressure dropped so fast my ears popped. The fog, the branches, the entire slope seemed to physically lean toward her voice. Suddenly, the trees no longer looked randomly spaced. They looked deliberately arranged, like a dark path had suddenly opened where no path had been. Then, from down in the drainage, a voice answered. But it wasn't Aaron. It was Caroline's own voice, exact and close. Repeating, "Aaron, keep talking." It wasn't an echo. It was a perfect copy. And Louise's voice came from the same spot, followed by my own voice. All of us were calling into the dark drainage at once, even though none of our mouths were moving. The copied voices overlapped, soft and patient. They bent the words, making them sound farther away, then terrifyingly near. Caroline stopped fighting Earl's grip, her face draining of color as she listened to herself speaking from the dark. And underneath all those stolen voices, the boys spoke one more time. "Dad?" Earl didn't take his eyes off the tree line.
He just whispered, "Walk backward."
Earl turned his head just enough for me to see the raw fear in his face.
He told us to walk backward. He said not to turn around until we felt the gravel of the main trail under our boots.
We obeyed him without question. We backed up along the snowy ridge, taking it one slow step at a time.
Down in the dark drainage below, the stolen voices followed us.
They never got louder, but they never faded away either.
Then a new voice rose above the rest.
It was an old, cracked woman's voice, singing a lullaby that sounded hauntingly familiar.
Beside me, Caroline began to cry without making a single sound. She later told me it was her grandmother's voice, a woman who had been dead for 15 years. We kept moving backward until our boots finally hit the packed gravel and ice of the main trail. The moment we stepped onto it, the normal sounds of the forest rushed back in. The wind, the creaking branches, and the sound of our own ragged breathing. I pulled my radio and called command. I told them we had auditory contact, but couldn't confirm the location due to echo and the steep terrain. It was another lie for the official report. Because how do you explain what we just heard? By the third day, the state police and reporters had arrived. Missing children always bring cameras, even to the frozen mountains. The official language hardened around us. They started talking about search zones, probability maps, and exposure windows. The family was moved away from the trailhead. They were starting to understand what nobody wanted to say out loud. An 11-year-old boy simply does not last 3 nights in those conditions without shelter. Not usually, anyway. But his voice kept translating. At 2:07 in the afternoon, every radio on our channel opened up at the exact same time. Searchers across 3 different trails heard a child breathing. Then Aaron's voice said, "I can see the lights. No teams had their lights on. It was broad daylight." Later that afternoon, a helicopter pilot reported seeing a small figure in red. It was standing in a gap between the trees near Myrtle Point. Ground teams scrambled and reached the spot in under an hour. They were desperate for a miracle. They didn't find a child. What they found was a perfect circle of melted snow. Inside that circle were dozens of small boot prints, all child-sized, and all of them facing inward. That detail, of course, never made it into the public report. After day 5, the search started scaling down. Nobody ever says the word abandon. They say transition. They say recovery. They say limited, continuous effort. But the family hears every word for what it really means. Aaron's dad stayed in town for 2 weeks. Every morning, he'd ask where we were searching. Every evening, he looked smaller. His daughter stopped speaking entirely. His wife moved like a person underwater. On the 9th day, Earl came to me privately. He said there was one more place, a maintenance spur off the Trillium Gap side. A place no tourist would ever find, partly washed out and choked with blowdown. He told me the old trailmen avoided it because sound behaved wrong up there. You could hear horses that weren't on the mountain anymore. Axes chopping wood. Children laughing. Or your own mother calling you in for supper. I asked him why he hadn't mentioned it earlier. His jaw worked for a long time before he finally answered. He looked right at me and said, "Because I heard him there yesterday." We went without telling command exactly where we were headed. That was my decision, and it was wrong. I can dress it up however I like. But the truth is, I was afraid they'd tell me not to go. It was just Earl and me. Late afternoon, gray sky, and fine snow falling. The kind that makes distance disappear. We climbed past ice-slicked roots, following a trace so faint it felt less like a trail and more like a memory.
Halfway up, we found Aaron's left glove sitting on a stump.
It was completely dry.
Not frozen, not wet.
It was dry and unnaturally warm when I picked it up.
Inside the glove was a folded piece of paper torn from our incident maps.
Somebody had drawn a pencil line from where he disappeared to exactly where we stood. But the line wasn't straight. It curved and looped like a child's maze. At the very end of that line was one single word: under.
Earl looked at it, and all the strength just seemed to leave his body.
He muttered, "That's where they keep saying it is."
We kept climbing.
Men are stupid when they've already gone too far.
The fog got so thick, our world shrank down to just the beams of our headlamps.
Just black trunks sliding past in the dark.
Then we saw a light up ahead.
It wasn't a flashlight. It was this low amber glow leaking through the trees, steady as a porch lamp.
Earl stopped dead in his tracks.
I told him there wasn't any cabin up here.
He just looked at me and said he knew.
The glow was sitting in a shallow bowl of land just below us.
As we got closer, shapes started forming in the fog.
A roof line. A chimney. It looked exactly like an old ranger cabiner. But there had never been a cabin there.
Say, I knew the park maps inside and out.
I knew what old foundations looked like. This wasn't ruins. It was whole. Weathered logs, a dark porch, and smoke rising from the chimney.
Just flattening out beneath the trees.
Then, from inside, we heard the sound of children whispering. Earl started backing away, but I couldn't stop myself. I moved forward. He grabbed my arm hard. He told me if I opened that door, it would learn me. None of it made any sense. But then I heard Aaron's voice from inside. He sounded so weak. He said, "Please, I'm cold now." I pulled my arm free.
I stepped up and the porch boards didn't even creak.
So, here's the weird thing. There was snow on the steps, but the porch itself was completely bare. The windows were pitch black, but that amber glow leaked around the edges, like the light inside was just too thick to see through. I reached out for the iron latch. Right behind me, Earl said my name. It wasn't a warning.
It was a goodbye.
I pulled the door open.
There was no room inside.
No floor, no stove, no boy, just trees. I was looking straight into a summer forest. Green leaves, sunlight, rhododendrons blooming, and somewhere, far away, a woman laughed. Then the view shifted again. Autumn, bare branches. A line of children standing between the trees, with their backs to me. It shifted again. Night, snow. Our search teams moving below, tiny lights crawling like insects. And then I saw Aaron. He stood maybe 20 feet beyond the threshold. He had his blue jacket on and one glove. No red cap.
His face was dirty, but he was alive.
His eyes were open. He looked at me with a calm so complete, it froze me harder than panic could have. He lifted one finger to his lips. Behind him, something moved among the trees. A body, not a shape.
More like the spaces between the trunks had started passing behind one another, in the wrong order.
Aaron whispered, "It can only keep what answers." Then Earl slammed into me from behind. We fell off the porch into the snow. The cabin vanished before we hit the ground.
There was no sound of collapse, no rush of air, no flash of light.
Say, one moment it was there. The next, we were lying beside a rotten stump on an empty slope. And Earl was screaming. Something had his leg. I saw the snow around his boot sink inward, like a hole had opened beneath it.
But there was no hole, just white crust dimpling around his ankle.
He clawed at roots.
I grabbed his pack straps and pulled. From the trees came my own voice.
Earl, give me your hand. Then Aaron's father's voice. Then Caroline's. Then a voice I hadn't heard since I was 16 years old. My brother, dead from a car wreck in '89, saying, "Come on, don't leave me here."
Earl stopped screaming.
He looked up at me, and for 1 second, he seemed peaceful.
"Don't answer," he said. The snow folded over his leg.
It didn't break.
It didn't open.
It folded, like a blanket being tucked in.
I pulled until something in my shoulder tore. Earl's hand slipped from a root.
His body slid backwards 6 inches, then a foot.
His face changed then. Not fear, recognition.
He whispered, "I wondered when it would use her."
A woman's voice called from the fog. Soft, loving.
"Earl, supper's ready."
He let go. I still feel his fingers leaving mine.
The snow just smoothed itself out where he'd been.
I ran.
There are brave men in this world, but I'm not one of them.
Not after that.
I ran downhill through branches that tore at my face.
I was slipping on ice, just trying to find the real trail. Behind me, the voices didn't chase. They guided me. Every single voice belonged to someone I had lost, or failed, or loved. I bit my tongue hard so I wouldn't answer them. When I finally stumbled onto the trail, a search team found me half-conscious. So, guilty confession. I told them Earl slipped down slope in the fog. I said we got separated and that I hit my head and couldn't remember. Some of that was true. They searched for Earl for 3 days. I only found one thing. His tobacco pouch, hanging neatly from a branch. Aaron Pike was never found, and neither was Earl. The official files use careful words like exposure and terrain hazards.
Caroline quit search and rescue before spring.
Aaron's parents ended up divorced there. His sister came back once as an adult and hiked to where he vanished.
She left a red knit cap tied to a branch.
By morning, it was gone.
I retired earlier than I should have.
I blamed it on a shoulder injury and stress. But the real reason is that every January, I start hearing radios click on in empty rooms. At first, it was just static. Then, breathing. Then a child saying he could see the lights. Last winter, I woke up at 3 in the morning to the sound of bells outside. I live 2 states away now, in a flat place with no mountains. I looked through the kitchen window and saw snow falling. But it was only falling in a narrow strip across my backyard. Beyond the fence, the grass was completely bare. In that snow stood a boy in a blue jacket. Specific detail, one hand bare, one hand gloved. He was facing away from me. And right beside him stood an old man with a bad knee and a tobacco-stained beard. Neither of them moved until my porch light flickered. Then the boy turned and raised one finger to his lips. I'm not telling this story to clear my conscience. I'm telling it because there are places where sound doesn't belong to the person who made it. There are hollows where grief is just bait. If you hear someone you love calling from below the trail, do not answer. If a child tells you it's warm under the snow, keep walking. If you see a cabin where no cabin should be, turn around. And if your radio clicks on by itself in the dark, pray you don't look outside and see the trees leaning toward your house.